Hello everybody, I'm Miss Jessica from 𝘏𝘏𝘭𝘦𝘴 and we are continuing our chapter book story time. We are reading Holes by Louis Sachar and we just left off with Stanley still digging his holes and still being punished by Mr. Sir because he was blamed for stealing the sunflower seeds, and then the warden scratched Mr. Sir, and so poor Stanley is taking the blame for that. But he's also definitely making friends with Zero, or now we know his name is Hector Zeroni, so that he can teach him how to read. And so they are definitely becoming closer. We're gonna have to see what happens there. And hello, Harper. Thank you for joining us. All right, so we're gonna start with chapter 30 today. Yeah. The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot as everyone headed outside. I get to sleep in because it's my birthday. Then a little while later, he cut into the breakfast line just in front of Squid. Squid told him to get to the end of the line. Hey, it's my birthday, Zigzag said, staying where he was. It's not your birthday, said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. Is too, said Zigzag, July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date. Could have been July 8th. How would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake, if indeed it was July 8th. I came here on May 24th, he said aloud. So that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He'd learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 46 days? It felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole that first day, and he hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he dug 44 holes if it really was July 8th. Can I have an extra carton of juice, Zigzag said to Mr. Sir. It's my birthday. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. The 45th hole was the hardest, he said to himself. But that really wasn't true, he said. He knew it. He was a lot stronger than when he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water. After having to get by on less water for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he had all the water he could want. Of course, it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually he stood around wet a while before setting off by himself on the hard ground with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, but not a lot better, but better. When the sun came up a couple of hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were a little more than a dark shadow on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of one of the mountains seemed to jut upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of sun reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somewhere near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. If that was really her lipstick tube he'd found, then she must have lived somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before the lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole and Zero climbed down into it. Hey, caveman, said Zigzag, you should get a whip. Then, if your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back. He's not my slave, said Stanley. We have a deal, that's all. A good deal for you, said Zigzag. It was Zero's idea, not mine. Don't you know, Zig, said X-Ray, coming over. Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero loves to dig holes. He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him, said Squid. Well, what about me, said Armpit. I like to dig holes, too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished? The other boys laughed. No, I want to, said Zigzag. It's my birthday. Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zigzag kept on it. Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig your hole. Stanley smiled as if it were all a big joke. When Mr. Pandinsky arrived with water and lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley his place in line. "Since you're so much better than me." Stanley remained where he was. I didn't say I was You're insulting him, Zig," said X-Ray. "Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman?" "No," said Stanley. "Sure you are," said X-Ray. "Now come to the front of the line where you belong." "That's okay," said Stanley. "No, it's not okay," said X-Ray. "Get up here." Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. "Well, this is a first," said Mr. Pandinsky, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he'd be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore. But he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into a sandwich, which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that just came in a can. Just about everything at Camp Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. "I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole," said Zigzag. Squid laughed. "Here, take my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it out for him. "No thanks," said Stanley. "Come on, take my cookie," said Zigzag, sticking it in his face. "Leave me alone," said Stanley. "Please eat my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed him back. "Don't push me." "I didn't." Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pandinsky was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. "I said, don't push me." Stanley took a step backward, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, "Quit pushing." "Lay off," said Armpit, as he, Magnet, and X-Ray joined them. Why should he?" snapped X-Ray. "Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself." "I don't want any trouble," Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. "Eat my cookie," he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pandinsky coming toward them along with Zero. "Hi, Mom," said Armpit. "We're just fooling around." "I saw what was going on," said Mr. Pandinsky. He turned to Stanley. "Go ahead, Stanley," he said. "Hit him back. You're bigger." Stanley stared at Mr. Pandinsky in astonishment. "Teach the bully a lesson," said Mr. Pandinsky. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. "Teach me a lesson," he challenged. Stanley made a feeble attempt to punch Zigzag. Then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag had hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backward into the dirt. "That's enough," Mr. Pandinsky yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. "Stop!" shouted Mr. Pandinsky. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fists slammed off his arms and pounded his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. Then suddenly, Zigzag was off of him. Stanley managed to look up and he saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a gagging sound as he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm off of him. "You're gonna kill him!" shouted Mr. Pandinsky. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Pandinsky fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office, the tents, or out on the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. "There was a riot," Mr. Pandinsky told her. "Zero almost strangled Ricky." The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. "What happened to you?" "Nothing. It wasn't a riot." Zigzag was beating up the caveman, said Armpit. Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull Zero off of Zigzag. It was all over before Mom fired his gun. "They just got a little hot, that's all," said X-Ray. "You know how it is, in the sun all day. People get hot, right? But everything's cool now." "I see," the warden said. She turned to Zigzag. "What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday?" "Zig's just a little hot," said X-Ray. "Out in the sun. You know how it is. The blood starts to boil." Is that what happened, Zigzag? Asked the warden. Yeah, said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun, while Caveman just sits around doing nothing. My blood boiled. Excuse me, said the warden. Caveman digs his holes, just like everyone else. Zigzag shrugged. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day, said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. I'm teaching him to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it? Excuse me, said the warden. Isn't it more important for him to learn to read, Stanley asked. Doesn't that build character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. Well, Zero, what have you learned so far? Zero said nothing. Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing? The warden asked him. He likes to dig holes, said Mr. Pandinsky. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the warden. Surely you can remember that. Zero said nothing. Mr. Pandinsky laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, You might as well try to teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero. The at sound, said Zero. The at sound, repeated the warden. Well then tell me, what does C-A-T spell? Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew he knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. Cat, Zero said. Mr. Pandinsky clapped his hands. Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius. F-A-T, asked the warden. Zero thought a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. F, at, fat. How about H-A-T, asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero, concentrating hard, then said, Chat. All the counselors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pandinsky. He's so stupid, he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pandinsky seemed to have it out for Zero. If Mr. Pandinsky only thought about it, he'd realize it was very logical for Zero to think the H made the ch sound. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole, said the warden, and no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes, because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled. Although he knew he wasn't digging just to learn a lesson, he was looking for something that belonged to Kissin' Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole but still teach Zero to read? He asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, said the warden. It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Pandinsky. I know you mean well, Stanley, but let's face it, Zero's too stupid to learn to read. That's what makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Pandinsky handed him the shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you'll ever be good for. Zero took the shovel. Then he swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Pandinsky's face. His knees crumpled beneath him. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The counselors all drew their guns. Zero held the shovel out in front of him as if he were going to try to bat away the bullies. I hate digging holes, he said. Then he slowly backed away. Don't shoot him, said the warden. He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept backing up, out past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then farther and farther out onto the lake. He's going to have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of the counselors helped Mr. Pandinsky to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out toward Zero, but he had disappeared into the haze. The warden offered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower room and the rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails and said, It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. Chapter 31. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Pandinsky, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, and his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather, but mostly he was angry at himself. He knew he should have never let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then he should have been able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach. What he should do, he thought, was go after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept his eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go after Zero. There was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking about that's what he should do. Maybe he should climb to the top of Big Thumb. It wasn't too far away. And if it was really the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge, and if after 100 years or so, water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought, they'd still have to come back here eventually. Then they'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself into deeper trouble. She might just say, "Tell me where you found it or I'll scratch you too." Plus, it would mean X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting by the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Pandinsky had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. "I always knew he was stupid," Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole the next day. As he dug, he kept a constant watch out for Zero, but he never saw him. Once again, he considered going out on the lake to look for him, but he began to realize that it was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it for some reason. His great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge? If it was still the same mountain. If water was still there. He tried to convince himself it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't impossible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pandinsky all waiting for him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of him at all?" "No." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No." "You know you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there for more than a day or 2. "I don't know where he is." All 3 stared at Stanley as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pandinsky's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. "You sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Pandinsky. "He's a ward of the state," Mr. Pandinsky told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested." "Is there anyone who might ask questions? Some social worker who took an interest in him?" "He had nobody," said Mr. Pandinsky. "He was nobody." The warden thought for a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all of his records." Mr. Pandinsky nodded. "He was never here," said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. "Can you get into the state files from our computer?" she asked Mr. Pandinsky. "I don't want anyone in the Attorney General's office to know he was here." "I don't think I can erase him completely from all the state files," said Mr. Pandinsky. "Too many cross-references, but I can make it so it would be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him. Like I said, though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni." "Good," said the warden. All right, we're going to stop there for today. So we just finished with chapter 31. So next time we'll start with chapter 32. And thank you so much for joining me today for our chapter book story time. And thank you, Harper, for joining us so much. And don't forget to go to EVPL Library, our YouTube page, and like and subscribe so you'll always be alerted as to when we add new content, which not just story times, we also have amazing things up there, activities for you to do. Don't forget to go to our webpage, evpl.org, and then you can see the schedule of what's coming up. We also have things that we post on social media, so definitely make sure you follow us there. And thank you again for joining us, and Harper and I will see you next time. Bye.